You know, people come up and say, boy, it was dry last year. And after a while, you just kind of run out of adjectives to describe how dry it was. It was bad. But what I hope you can do is take those lessons learned from the past and apply them toward the future. Because as Chuck indicated, these cycles tend to repeat themselves. It was dry last year. That was last year. What did we learn from that we can apply toward the future and future production? But at some point in time, we will experience another one of those dry weather events. Hopefully not to the severity that we had last year, but it will occur again. And kind of what I want to open up with is kind of tell you a little bit of a story. This is a shot of a ranch up in kind of northeastern Oklahoma. This is a shot of some of their range here. It's very high condition range. You can see a lot of big blue stem there, a little blue stem. There's switchgrass in there. Very well conditioned range. This is another shot of that same ranch that's in during kind of the late part of the growing season. You can see an abundance of forage there. It's kind of covering up the calves back there in the background. This particular ranch went through the same drought that everybody else did. But here's something I want you to think about. This particular ranch didn't begin hay feeding till mid-February of this year. Absolutely phenomenal for a drought year, coming out of the drought. I talked with the manager of this ranch a few weeks ago. He said that his average hay feeding per cow was around 1,000 pounds this year is all the hay that he fed. He did not destock going through this drought, but what really has helped him in his drought recovery is his prior year's management. That's one thing that I want to really hone in on today, hope you go away from, is that your prior year's management really dictate how well you will recover from these drought events such as we had last year. A couple other things that I want you to think about. This particular ranch, I started working with them 10 years ago when I first came to the foundation. He would come down yearly and have an office visit with us. His main concern that he had was, where and how am I going to produce enough hay to carry 1,200 cows a year? And he was absolutely consumed by that. They were wearing out equipment. A lot of this range country is pretty rough. It's hard to get haying equipment to run over it. He would just absolutely agonize over his main concern was where and how much hay can I get stored up to make it through the next winter. In 10 years' time, his philosophy has really changed. He doesn't talk about hay or hay production anymore. He talks about grazing, grazing management, and grazing days. How many grazing days can I get off this place? And every year he has the philosophy, I can do it better this year than I did before. He does a lot of things differently. This year, his feeding program, his supplementation program for his main cow herd was he incorporated a mixture of ryegrass and turnips. He began grazing turnips in December. He had allocated about 100 acres of this. He broke this up into 5-acre paddocks. He has his cattle all in one mob. His typical feeding day would be to funnel about 800 cows into a 5-acre paddock. They time grazed that for about 4 or 5 hours, came back out of that, and then he would hay what little hay he did after that for another few hours. Cattle condition was very well. The other thing that he did was these paddocks were separated with a single-strand high tensile fence, a single-strand polywire fence. They had a lane that he would funnel them down, funnel into a 5-acre paddock, and then funnel them back out. So it's just amazing what you can do, and I kind of want you guys just to kind of think about the possibilities of what you can do. We'll read this to you. I ran across this back a month or so ago when I was looking at range recovery and drought recovery. This is from 1956. This is from out of one of the Texas experiment stations, and I'll read this to you. It's talking about the drought that occurred in the mid-50s and the recovery from that. The damage resulting on the ranges of Texas from the 5-year drought period 1949 to 54 can be correlated with land management and the type of soil. In general, ranges that were properly managed before and during the drought came through in fair to good condition. Overstocked ranges were severely damaged and subsequent recovery has been very limited. Thus, ranchmen have evidence of the need for carrying out proper management practices year after year, not only to meet drought periods, but to build for an economic unit by capitalizing on the years of favorable moisture. Thus, the old rule still prevails that close grazing does not pay. What I took away from this was even in 1956, that was an old rule that close grazing did not pay. History tends to repeat itself. Sometimes the lessons that were learned years ago are hard to accept and hard to apply. Chuck showed this earlier. This is certainly a welcome relief compared to what we have experienced previously. If you had looked at this seasonal drought outlook in December, the 1st of January, it did not look like this. They were predicting the first 3 months of 2012 to still have persisting drought conditions. Thank goodness that this has changed. This is the latest drought outlook for the period April 5th through June 30th. It shows us to still be in pretty good conditions. This is a little bit different take on what Chuck showed you earlier. This is from East Texas, but it can apply anywhere. I just took the weather precipitation yearly and put it into decade periods so that you can see that cycling effect. You know, there's periods of below average rainfall and the periods of way above average rainfall, followed by periods of drought. And then you can see in the 90s, a 30-year period there where we were really, really above average and where a lot of our habits and a lot of our production that we expect came from. When you look at yearly rainfall precipitation, you can see that it fluctuates very wildly. And unfortunately for a lot of producers, their forage production, their management also fluctuates very wildly according to the rainfall that we get year to year. Here's some sites where you can, Chuck mentioned tracking weather, tracking rainfall. Here's some sites that you can go to that will help you do that. The Oklahoma Mesonet is a series of weather stations that are distributed throughout Oklahoma. You might be very surprised to know that you probably have a Mesonet site relatively close to your own operation. Texas State Climatologist has some good information on drought conditions, along with the Texas Water Development Board. The Water Development Board really does have good information on drought monitoring, and they keep that up to date on a fairly regular basis. Usually when we're in a drought condition, they will change that every week or so. Drought Mitigation Center, that's where the previous couple slides came from. They do a lot of forecasts and outlooks. They keep those constantly updated, and of course your local NOAA Weather Service. How many of you have some type of a smartphone now? An iPhone or some other type of smartphone? I found out yesterday that the Oklahoma Mesonet actually has an app. So you can download the Oklahoma Mesonet, and it's essentially the same information that you can find online is now available through an app on your iPhone. I downloaded it yesterday. Tremendous, powerful information that you can carry around with you. All right, the road to recovery. Take steps to avoid insanity. I think everybody knows what the definition of insanity is. Repeating the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result, right? Well, what I mean by this is we know that these weather patterns cycle. We know that our precipitation can swing widely. We know that the grass production that we have is going to be linked to our precipitation. That being the case, we need to manage for the long term. And there's some other things that we need to balance around in that. One is, the very first thing I think you need to be doing is measuring what your cost of production is. If you're not doing that currently, you need to start. Because how can you make steps forward if you don't know where you currently stand? This is just some information that comes out of SPA, Standardized Performance Analysis. This little blip of information is just a tiny bit of information that you can get from SPA record analysis. It's done in Oklahoma, it's done in Texas. It allows you to compare your own production against your neighbor's production, against production in another state or even nationwide, and see where you rank in terms of your cost of production. When we look at this, This is raised purchase feed cost per cow. We can see that now this is records over the last 5 years from SPA Region 2 in Texas, which is the north central region in Texas. I say that if you move that into south central Oklahoma, these feed costs would be very similar. But on average, over the last 5 years or so, the average purchase feed cost per cow was $158.36. The majority of producers is going to fall into that range. But if you go one standard deviation above that, you have producers that their cow cost is $240.87, or one standard deviation below that, it can be as cheap as $75.85. I have worked with some producers. When you start analyzing what's driving these costs, I have literally worked with some producers that feed hay 6 months out of the year. When you get into a situation like that, there's some basic things that you need to go back and take a look at. Chuck mentioned them earlier. I'm going to hit them again. Stocking rate. There's something probably not right, that you have something out of balance, that you're not producing enough forage on your particular place to support the number of grazing animals that you're trying to run. So, our long-term drought management, our long-term management sustainability is going to begin with carrying capacity, and that's simply balancing the amount of forage that you can produce on average for the long term with the amount of mouths that you have to feed. And within this, you can build in some drought insurance as well, by how much residual forage you leave on the ground, how much of that ground cover you're able to leave on the ground. Some producers have in mind that if I don't get it all, I'm leaving dollars out there. No, you're not leaving dollars. You're leaving forage persistence and sustainability out there. You're leaving that grass with the ability to continue to produce. I'm going to run through very quickly how we kind of do this at the Noble Foundation when we're working with a producer. We'll begin with their soils. Very important, because there's a tremendous amount of variation in the soils and their ability to produce forage. The other thing we'll do is we will develop a map so that you know exactly how many grazing acres that you have. Many producers underestimate or overestimate exactly what they have on their place. Some people also can take in the woods and everything else, things that are not really grazable or produce very little forage in terms of their total carrying capacity. We look at the amount of grazable acres that you have. The next thing we'll do is we'll look at the soils map. So over here on the right, over here on the right, we have an example of a map that you can get with us where we look at each individual pasture, the amount of grazable acres within that pasture, and what it is that you're trying to produce within that pasture. The next thing we'll do is we'll overlay a soils map on top of that. The soils map, if you don't already currently have some historical records of the amount of production that you're getting off of these pastures, we'll start with the soil survey. Tremendous amount of information there available to you. The soil survey, how many of you have seen the Oak County Soil Survey books? Every county should have one. They're free. All that information is now being placed on the web. All the updates are being placed on the web. And here's the address, the Web Soil Survey, nrcs.usda.gov. If you don't have a map of your property, you can actually go in there and produce a map of your property by going in and outlining your property, laying over a soil series, and then within that, you can get the production of your range and the production of your introduced forages. It takes a little bit of time. It's fairly user-friendly, but it's well worth your time if you haven't done that. One thing that sometimes we kind of underestimate or we tend to overlook is just how much forage an animal will consume on a day, a month, a year. I've had a lot of these producer meetings, and I will ask a lot of producers, you know, how much is a cow going to consume in a day? You'd be surprised at the answers I get. 5 pounds, 100, we really don't know. On average, she's going to consume about 2.5% of her body weight per head per day, and that's dry matter production, or dry matter on a dry matter basis. So on average, 25 to 35 pounds per head per day. That's going to vary depending upon the time of the year, the quality of the forage, and the animal that you're trying to produce. On a per monthly basis, that's going to be equivalent to taking what she does on a day, multiplying it by 30 days, and it's going to come out to be about 750 to 1,050 pounds per month or more. So in terms of just visualizing that, that's roughly about 1 round bale a month. So if you have 100 cows, think about that and the volume of production that your pastures and your range has to produce just to meet the demand, dry matter demand of these cattle. On a yearly basis, 9,000 to 12,000 pounds per year, somewhere in that neighborhood, depending upon the size of the animal. So the question is, what's going to happen to our pastures, our range, if this is all we supply her on a per yearly basis? Should that be all we supply her? Can she utilize that much? Well, yeah, that's her demand, but if that's all we allow her to have, she can't consume 100% of it. She's not a vacuum cleaner. She can't physically get all of it. There's going to be some loss to trampling. There's going to be some loss to urine and defecation. The other thing is, we need to leave that residue out there. We need to leave some type of growth, residual growth, for the health, the long-term persistence of not only the top of that plant, but we also need to be thinking about what's being produced underneath, and that's the root system. It's real easy to go out there and see what's on top, but we also have to think about what's underneath the plants and underneath that soil surface as well. So, what do? We talk in terms of percent utilization, and we vary that according to what it is, the particular forage species that we're talking about. For our introduced forages, many of those we can graze a little bit harder than our native range plants. So for our Bermudagrass, our introduced forages, we might take 50%, 65%, 75%. If it's a winter annual, we may take 90% of it. It just depends on what species that we're talking about. On our native range, we might float that just depending upon the condition of the range. If it's low condition and we want to improve it, we're not going to take very much. It might be less than 25% utilization. If it's good condition range, it might go up to 35%, maybe a little bit more depending upon the manager's ability. If you're rotational grazing or if you're continuous grazing, I'm going to fluctuate those utilization percentages a little bit differently. We take all that information. We take the cows that you have, we take the individual production per pasture, and we put it into a little spreadsheet. And we press, it's just simply math here, but we're able to go through here and get an estimate of the production or the carrying capacity of a particular place for you. On this particular example here, grazable acres are 738. We estimated total production over 3 million pounds, and we're estimating that for a 12-month carrying capacity, 1,200 pound cows, he can run about 200 cows on that total place for a year, with all the forage being produced, all the forage required being produced on that particular place. And we do also include our percent utilizations over here and varying them according to whether they're native grass, Bermudagrass, or fescue. Now, there's a similar tool to this available on our website. If you go to www.noble.org and go to the Ag Division page within that website, we have a whole series of tools, online calculators that you can use. These are flash drive driven calculators, and we do have a version of the carrying capacity tool on there for you to use. All right, drought damage, drought recovery. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to vary by the soils. Sandier, lighter soils got a whole lot hotter than they did last year. It's really, really hard to keep cover on those sandy soils. You know, it just tends to turn over a lot more than it does on our blackland soils. So, drought recovery on lighter, sandier soils may be a little bit harder than on some of the heavier soils that had a little bit more water holding capacity to them. Previous management, that's going to be a huge factor into our drought recovery this year. And as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a wide range in that. People that have done a good job in grazing management in years prior to this year are going to recover a lot quicker than those who have not. Species, is going to vary quite a bit. This is tall fescue that's kind of in a region maybe it shouldn't have been, and on some soil that it shouldn't have been, and it's gone. There is a lot of tall fescue in our region that did not make it, and it won't be back. There is tall fescue as far east as Hugo, Oklahoma, that I've seen that is not going to come back. The key component that I have seen with the tall fescue and its ability to recover is how hard it was grazed in May of last year. If there was no residual growth going into the dry weather, it's gone. But there are a few producers that managed to pull off of it early, leave about 4, 5, 6 inches of growth. It's still there. It may be a weakened, we've lost a few plants, but it still does have the ability to come back. Soil fertility, that's a tough one. That's a tough topic to talk about. I looked at our April fertilizer prices, and they're jumping. Nitrogen costs depending upon the form. Some of our nitrogen, if you're looking at ammonium sulfate, is now costing us about $1.22, 3, 4, 5 cents a pound per pound of N. Phosphorus costs are rising, potassium costs are up, but in soils that were low in phosphorus and low in potassium, we're seeing a bigger hit as a result of the drought than those that are probably closer to 100% sufficiency levels. Root damage. This is one that's concerning me quite a bit, especially on our Bermudagrass pastures. This is just kind of an old slide that shows you the overgrazing effects or repeated close grazing of plants over time and the effect that it has on drought management. Now just think about this. If you were in a situation where you were perhaps overgrazing previous years, this may be what your plants came into last year's season with in terms of root development. So what was their ability to go and find additional moisture deep down? Not very good. The other thing that is kind of concerning me is, for the first time since I've been here, our Bermudagrass pastures absolutely went dormant last year. They just shut down. So if we think about dormancy and what it is dormancy dead plants? No, dormancy is not dead plants. They are simply, it's a mechanism for them to survive this dry weather period. They are still alive. They're still pulling their energy reserves. They're pulling those from the crowns and from the root system. Now, let's think about this and start putting 2 and 2 together. Our Bermudagrass went dormant last year. For a short time period, late last fall, it did wake up, and we got a little bit of late season production. And for most of our warm season perennial plants, that 60 to 90 days prior to frost is extremely important for them to rebuild root reserves that they use to kick off spring growth with. And if you think about plants and how they function, normally once they kick off growth and really get rolling into the spring and into the summer, where are they generating energy from? Leaf growth. In the spring, they don't have it, so they got to pull it. All right? These plants, our Bermudagrass plants, really did have a short period of time to do that before they were entered drought or entered frost again and went back dormant again. So my fear is, even though they look really good right now, they've kicked off growth early. We have a lot of growth on some of our common Bermudagrass. It's looking pretty good. Tifton 85, it's the latest one anyway. I don't know where it's going to stand. I've heard reports west of I-35 that some of the Tifton 85 is really damaged there. It's a late oncomer. We may not really know, but even though conditions look really good right now, my fear is that some of these plants, some of our Bermudagrass pastures may be a little bit weaker than we may be giving them credit for being. So don't overestimate this early spring production. If we turn off dry again this summer, and things still look pretty good, forecasts are saying we've got a 50-50 chance of being above or below normal. I'll take it compared to where we were last year. But if things get bad again during the summer, we could really re-hammer those pastures again. Our bunch grasses, again, we could do the same thing to them, but on the other hand, on the positive side of things, These perennial grasses really do have a strong ability to recover if we give them the ability to do that. Bermuda grass especially, it has numerous growth points and numerous ways that it can regenerate itself if we give it a chance to do that. Our bunch grasses, our natives, don't quite have this, they don't grow the same way. They're a little bit different from a morphological standpoint, but still we have a good chance from a management standpoint for them to recover. So, assessing what you have. We have seen an awful lot of this. This is ryegrass over Bermuda grass this spring. I have never seen such strong cool season annual production as what we've had. Coming into last fall, I would not have predicted that we would have had the growth that we had off our cool season grasses. The rainfall has just been timely. We've had above average temperatures and just an abundance of forage. And it's kind of funny. I'm getting calls now from producers of, what do I do with all this stuff? You know, compared to last year, it's, what do? I don't have anything. I've got too much. So it's feast and famine, as we mentioned earlier. This has been a good thing. It's allowed us to get off of hay feeding a lot earlier than we thought we could have. But as Chuck mentioned, and somebody has had a question, it can be a bad thing as well. But what do we do? Well, we're going to have to just live with it, because unfortunately at this time period we can't come in there chemically and take the cool season grasses off, because our Bermuda grasses, our warm seasons have already kicked off, so we can't do that. In terms of adding additional head, if you could get somebody to come in and maybe graze on the game, but it's still just a real short period. The advice that I had to a producer yesterday was bunch all your cattle together, high stock density if you can, run through there, and if you can't get it grazed, at least get it mashed down, get it trampled down, get some sunlight down there to those warm season perennial grasses that are coming on. Haying, sure, if you can hay it and get it put up in these conditions, again, that's another option for you as well. All right, what do your Bermuda grass pastures look like? This is a fairly thin pasture here. It's got some open space in here. This year, these open spaces are going to be taken up by either annual grasses or broadleaf weeds that are coming on very early this year. We had broadleaf, I saw ragweed up in March, mid-March this year. It was up about that tall, probably about as early as I have ever seen it. But how do you assess these pastures in terms of developing a management plan to move forward? Typically what I tell producers to do is, if you have some question of Bermuda grass recovery, take a walk across the pasture. And as you walk, take a look down and see what you're stepping on. This particular pasture here, I would say that you would be stepping on a Bermuda grass rhizome or rhizome, at least at every step. And I would say if you have at least that much Bermuda grass out there, it will recover. Because essentially, if you think about it, that would be like a resprigging, or what it would be coming up from sprigging, if you think about it being placed in a row. So this will recover. Can you graze it? Yeah, maybe, but you need to take that into account, that it's still a developing or a redeveloping stand. You'll need to control your weeds as much as possible, and then also do some soil testing as well. Here's some general rules of thumb on recovery. 30% loss or less, I think you have an excellent stand of chance of recovery. What's that look like? That's not very much damage out there in terms of a per pasture basis. 30 to 60% stand loss, still a good chance of recovery, but you're going to have to do a good job of management there to get it back to 100% stand. 60% stand loss or greater, this is when I would consider maybe some type of renovation. In terms of renovating this year, I think our window is beginning to close on us fairly rapidly. Bermuda grass recovery, soil test, especially with our high fertilizer prices that we've got, you want to know exactly what you need to put out and the amounts that you need to put out before you go and just willy-nilly throw some triple 17. Treat as a new establishment, control weeds, control and correct your soil fertility. Add seed or sprigs, maybe, maybe not. I tend toward the maybe not. If you've got a fairly good stand out there already, Bermuda grass typically is so aggressive that if you add seed, it's probably going to be overwhelmed by the existing Bermuda grass. Adjusting your stocking rate is probably going to be the most important thing that you can do. Bunch grass recovery, you're going to follow a similar pattern as to your Bermuda grass recovery. Bunch grasses may recover quite a bit slower. Again, soil test, control your weeds, adjust your stocking rate. Chuck mentioned rest. Again, that's very strong, a very good management program for these bunch grasses. If you can allow them to set seed and drop that seed, sometimes you can get some seedling recruitment that way. Rest during the early part of the growing season, during the active part of the growing season if possible. Then defer that and maybe graze later on as a standing hay crop after frost, or at least graze them after the 4th of July. Add seed. Again, it's kind of the same thing as with Bermuda grass. It can be really tough to add seed into an existing stand of perennial grasses. Range recovery, fair to good condition, rest, rest, rest. Control weeds, maybe. I've got one of our wildlife specialists here staring at me because, you know, a lot of the weeds that they call forbs are excellent wildlife food, especially if you like bobwhite quail. You know, I think one of the number one things that bobwhite quail like to eat is ragweed seed. Excuse me. So it may be a good time to evaluate your goals. Poor condition range, again, evaluate your goals, total rest if possible. Soil test, some of these poor condition range sites may need a little kick in phosphorus that may kind of help them in their recovery. And it's going to take a lot of patience as well on some of these very low and poor condition range sites. One of the most common questions I ask is, do I need to add seed? And I really am hesitant on asking seed. One thing is that on a lot of our native grasses, the price of seed has really, really increased because there's essentially no seed crop last year. It was about $10 a pound a couple years ago. It's up to about $20 this year. So if you're going to invest that into renovation, make sure that you're giving yourself as much chance as you possibly can to have success with that reseeding. Starting over, if you're in that process of having to actually look at it and restart, again, evaluate your goals. What do you want that forage to do? What are your soil types? What's your management ability? Soils, if you're looking at an introduced forage, we typically say, well, Bermuda grass fits all. It does. It fits a lot of places. But on some of these heavier clay soils, there might be better options for you to add. Here's just some examples of soil types and what you might find or what you might be able to put there. Gearing up for our 2012 forage production, soil test, soil test, soil test. We do have a lot of residual carryover from the previous year. You can test for that, see what you do have, adjust nitrogen rates accordingly. Control your weeds in these introduced pastures. Know the species that you're trying to control. Hit them at the right time with the right chemical, at the right rate, and the right amount of water. And calibrate your sprayers. Apply fertilizer. If you can afford to do that and you need the production and can utilize the production, apply the fertilizer, especially if you're low in phosphorus and potassium. That's going to help you rebuild those root systems as well. 2012 forage production, close the gates. You gain management control when you keep your gates closed. When you open the gates and let them go, you've lost your management control. Those cattle are now managing you, and you're not managing them. Make sure your stocking rate's correct. Manage the top growth in a manner appropriate for that particular species. Our forage forecast for 2012, we already know that our cool seasons have been very strong, very aggressive. They can have an effect on our warm season perennials. At this point, it's really tough to do anything about it, but be aware of it. Our perennial grasses, I think, are still we have potential for good production, but just keep in mind that if you've weakened that root growth over prior year's management, it's going to take time to regenerate that. Our native worm seasons are coming on strong and early now. I think time will tell, another 30 to 60 days really to see how well they are recovering. And our weed population has been very early and aggressive, and it's taken up space that's been opened up by some of our previous plant laws. Adjust stocking rates accordingly and rest as much as you possibly can. Aljo?
Do we have a quick question right quick?
Dr. Rogers, in that first slide, you showed about a ranch up there that you also forage, currants, stuff like that.
Yeah.
You said that was a polywire they were dividing off with?
Yeah, it is. It was a polywire with step-in posts. Now, you know, that takes time to get there. You know, these things that he's done and been able to accomplish, he hasn't done overnight. He spent some time training those cows to respect that polywire.
One other quick question. If you got some new ground, I had 10 acres inundated by cedars, and I'm in the process of clearing it and other scrub brush. What would you plant for something like that? Would you Bermudagrass be still my best bet?
What's the soil type?
Sandy.
Bermudagrass fits real well there. It just depends on your goal, what you want it to do. You know, if you're willing to fertilize and manage and you need that production that Bermudagrass can give you and you can utilize that, then it still has a real good fit.
I mean, this is like a forest, you know, as I'm clearing off myself, the skid steer and tree clipper, I've got a lot of bare ground there, I see. No forage showing at all. What I need to get in there so I don't lose everything.
Oh, something quick?
Right.
Oh, okay. And you still have the stumps there and everything?
No, I'm cutting right at ground level. I won't have this like there. I'm cutting everything ground level. Some of the stuff I can pull out by the roots.
Okay, okay. Something quick that can go, you might look at some type of a summer annual just to go in there. Now if you're looking at seeding Bermudagrass, we still have that window of opportunity to seed Bermudagrass. Some of the seed companies say as late as June 15th. I really think that if you're going to do that, my cutoff is probably around May 1st, May 15th, because I just don't know what's going to happen with the summer and the dry weather. The worst thing I could do is seed it, get it up about that big, and it turns dry on it. But you still have the opportunity to do something like that. If not, you might just go with some type of a cover crop this summer. Soil test, see what your acid levels are, your P and K. Then you might go with maybe a sorghum Sudan, something like that, just to hold that ground together, and then get it ready for the next spring to come in with more of a permanent type pasture.